for having me, everyone. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is the land on which we're meeting today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I would like to acknowledge that this always was, always will, and always is and always will be Aboriginal land. This week is National Reconciliation Week, and it's a really important time for all Australians to stop and take stock of who we are as a nation, to have a think about where we have been, our history, and what we want our future to look like. This time every year I have a think about where I came from, and I grew up in a small town in the Riverina area of New South Wales, a little place called Narrandera. Lots of people have strange connections to Narrandera, so I'm sure I'll meet someone here tonight who does. But growing up in Narrandera was a reminder every day that Australia has a long way to go to meet reconciliation properly. At my school, when I went to primary school in Narrandera, the non-Indigenous parents didn't talk to the Indigenous parents. They would stand on opposite sides of the school gate. Teachers were often racists, sometimes very proudly, and the police were called in regularly. I remember when I was about 10 years old in my Year 4 classroom looking outside the window, and there was a little boy who was in the same class as me who was being hauled out of school by 4 police officers. One had an arm and a leg each. He was only 10 years old, and I can only imagine where he is today. That was his first entrance into the justice system. Now, Louise has gone through quite a lot of the statistics that I was going to run through, but I'm going to say them again because it's really important, and I think that the national consciousness has shifted to this, and we need to make sure that it stays strong. So the gap between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people still exists, and it's really stark in the justice system. Right now, Indigenous people are 13 times more likely to be locked up, but make up a very, very small proportion of our population. Nationally, Indigenous kids are 24 times more likely to be locked up than their non-Indigenous schoolmates. And in Western Australia, that's 54 times more likely, which is worse than African American kids in the US. In the past 10 years, we've seen an 88% increase in the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prison. And being placed in prison is all too common for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the impact is broad. It's not just on those people, but it's on their families, it's on their communities, and it's on the broad kinship relationships that they have. It's a significant human rights issue, and there are ripple effects. Governments across Australia are still creating laws that create this problem, laws that disproportionately affect Indigenous people for short-term political gain. And Louise has mentioned the mandatory sentencing laws in Western Australia. These laws actively propagate these shocking statistics. Only last week, the Northern Territory government tried to rush through these new bail laws. These would remove the presumption of the favour of bail for people who have existing property-related offences. In the Northern Territory, more than 90% of people in prison are Aboriginal. This law, if passed, would see people locked up without conviction or access to consideration of bail. And this is in direct contravention to Article 9 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is that nobody should be arbitrarily detained, and Article 11, which is that everybody shall be entitled to the presumption of innocence. These are human rights issues. There is a long history, both in this country and in others, of politicians from all parts of the ideological spectrum who have shown their preparedness to trade off other people's human rights when it suited their own political interests. Tonight's discussion around a Human Rights Act is part of a broader picture about government, about power, and about people. Is a Human Rights Act in Australia's future? Well, it's a big question, and I certainly hope so, but this dream seems to be growing ever more distant. Governments across political persuasions are grabbing at our rights to extend their own power. The arguments in favour of a Human Rights Act are both strong and enduring. The codification of individual rights can be traced back through human history. Documents like the British Magna Carta of 1215, the French Declaration on the Rights of Man from 1789, the American Bill of Rights from 1789, the Geneva Convention of 1864, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, the Canadian Human Rights Act 1977, the South African Constitution 1996, and the UK Human Rights Act of 1998 are rightly to be seen as milestones in the development of our civilizations. What makes the rights outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights universal is that they have been developed over centuries by many nations and across political ideologies. They are neither a fad, nor do they belong in a single political tradition. They are a statement of the basic rights to which all human beings are entitled to, and which therefore should not be granted or withheld at the whim of governments, whether democratically elected or not. 65 years ago, the newly created United Nations General Assembly proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Emerging from the ashes of a horrendous war that cost nearly 50 million lives, it introduced the word genocide into our language. The declaration was agreed upon by all countries as a statement of universal human values that all nations should uphold and the rights that all people in this world should enjoy. Australians played a leading role in this declaration. Australia was one of the 8 nations involved in its drafting. The Minister for External Affairs, Doc Everett, was the head of Australia's delegation to the UN, and he was the president of the UN General Assembly at the time that the declaration was adopted. In 1948, Australia was one of the world's leaders in human rights, but I doubt any objective observer would say so now. What would they make of the suspension of the Anti-Discrimination Act to allow for the Howard government's intervention into Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory? What would they make of the Papua New Guinea asylum seeker policy created by the Rudd Labor government that ignores the fundamental principles of the Refugee Convention? And what would they make of the frightening continuation of Operation Sovereign Borders enforced under Abbott and Turnbull today? What we often see is government proudly spruiking Australia's human rights history, say in a bid for a seat at the UN Security Council, or even our upcoming bid for a spot on the Human Rights Council. They'll spruik this often while announcing the latest measure to remove or restrict the rights of a minority group. Our right to freedom of peaceful assembly is one of the latest rights under attack, and on a wide scale, in Australia and globally. In recent years, these types of laws have been introduced in Victoria, Tasmania, Queensland, Western Australia, and in New South Wales. It's pretty reasonable to assume that many of these laws have been created by governments to deal with environmental, anti-CSG, and lock-the-gate protesters, as well as others who give government and corporations a hard time implementing their will. WestConnex is a really good local example of this. The right to assemble peacefully together with the freedom of expression and association rests at the core of any functioning democratic system. The right to protest peacefully is a defining feature of Australia's liberal democracy, and yet we see it today under threat. Everybody has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Those very words are enshrined in Article 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they're also protected in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that Australia signed in 1980 but still hasn't ratified, and that's another really important reason for a Human Rights Act. I want to focus on New South Wales for a moment. So New South Wales' new harsh and unnecessary anti-protest laws are the latest example of an alarming and unmistakable trend. Governments across Australia are eroding some of the vital foundations of Australia's democracy in order to entrench their political power and that of business interests. The New South Wales laws give police excessive new powers to stop, search and detain protesters and seize property, as well as to shut down peaceful protests that obstruct traffic. They expand the offence of interfering with a mine, which carries a penalty of up to 7 years in jail, to cover coal seam gas exploration and extraction sites. These laws create a 10-fold increase to the penalty to unlawful entry to enclosed land. Basically any public or private land surrounded by a fence, surrounded by some bushes, where there's any sort of barrier that could be interpreted as such. if the person interferes or intends to interfere with business there, and intends is a really key word here. At the same time as ratcheting up this penalty for individuals who protest, the New South Wales government has also recently made changes which mean that resource companies that illegally mine can receive a $5,000 penalty notice instead reduced from a potential $1.1 million fine. Tasmania last year targeted environmental protesters with a broad and new vague offence, including hindering access to business premises or obstructing business operations, with penalties of up to $10,000 and 4 years imprisonment. I'm sure you guys would have seen in the news Bob Brown's case. He was one of the people who has been caught up with this law. In Western Australia, proposed legislation contains extremely broad new offences of physically preventing a lawful activity and possessing a thing, I'm not sure what a thing is, but a thing, for the purpose of preventing a lawful activity, and that's enshrined in that legislation. With proposed penalties for those two offences of up to 2 years in prison and fines of up to $24,000. The previous Victorian government also extended police powers by introducing move-on orders. This legislation has been appealed, but is also a really frightening part of this ongoing trend. Common to these anti-protest laws are the ambiguity of terms, harsher penalties, excessive police powers, and the prioritisation of business interests, particularly those of mining and forestry operations, over the rights of Australians to gather together and protest about issues that they deeply care about. State laws are going too far in restricting protest activity, prioritising powerful business and political interests over people's democratic rights to organise and speak out in their interests. United Nations experts have made statements calling on both the Tasmanian and Western Australian governments to abandon its enacted and/or proposed anti-protest laws. They said, and I quote, "It will have a chilling effect of silencing dissenters and outlawing speech protected by international human rights law." They've gone ahead anyway. The power has shifted from people and civil society to groups to politicians and to corporations. The main benefit of a Human Rights Act is preventative. It provides a counterbalance to the overwhelming power of governments and corporations compared to individual citizens. This is not the only area where Australia has a questionable record on human rights. Asylum seeker policy is a pretty clear example. Indigenous rights, rights of LGBTQI people, metadata and mass surveillance, and the continually broad overreach of anti-terror legislation. And I've got no doubt that you guys are thinking of a lot more as I go through that list. A Human Rights Act would not only help address these issues, but also Australia's declining international standing. It would bring us into line with other democracies like the UK, USA, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, and put us in a strong position in our bid for a seat on the UN Human Rights Council. It would improve domestic implementation of Australia's international human rights obligations, which are so often missed. It would improve the lives of people and limit complaints and criticism for non-compliance. Last year in Geneva, Australia was subject to our Universal Periodic Review on Human Rights. 110 countries spoke at this review and provided 291 recommendations to Australia. Of these recommendations, 150 were accepted, 50 were noted to consider further, and 90 were just noted. The dominant issue that was raised was our asylum seeker policy. Peer countries recommended the end to the turn-back policy, now bipartisan. They recommended an end to offshore detention and mandatory detention. Some countries were concerned about the lack of transparency and the rights of whistleblowers with Operation Sovereign Borders. Some were concerned about the possible refoulement of people seeking asylum back to Sri Lanka and to Vietnam. Critics included important allies to Australia like the US, UK, and other countries that suffer most of the burden in caring for refugees like Turkey and Kenya. Many countries also raise concerns with the disproportionate rate that Indigenous people are locked up in Australia, and picked out state-based laws, including Western Australia's mandatory sentencing laws, for specific scrutiny. The rights of people with disability were raised, women and LGBTQI people. Australia was reminded of its decision to implement a 2011 recommendation to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. This would allow independent monitors access to places of detention and would have significant implications for Indigenous people and those people who are seeking protection. The review happened in November last year, again, and it still hasn't been ratified to this date. A few years back in 2009, the dream of a Human Rights Act seemed brighter and within reach. The then Labor government undertook a nationwide consultation on this very question. Australians wanted a Human Rights Act in their future, and were cognizant that many of our rights are not protected anywhere. During the 2009 consultation surveys showed public support for a Human Rights Act was running at over 80%. This was reflected in the submissions to the government's consultation committee, with over 80% of 35,000 individual submissions in favour. With support in Australia running at better than 4 out of 5, there is no doubt that many people who vote Conservative also support the creation of a Human Rights Act. There is no reason for a Human Rights Act to be a bipartisan issue. There is no excuse really for not having one in place already. Tomorrow is June 3. It's Mabo Day. It commemorates the High Court of Australia's landmark decision in 1992, which legally recognised that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have a special relationship to the land, a relationship that existed prior to colonisation and still exists today. This is something to celebrate, but it's also a reminder that rights are not simply given because it's the right thing to do. They are fought for and they are hard won. Human rights are universal. They belong to all of us, but they are rarely given to us. They only exist when they are demanded, protected, and nurtured by societies. They are always under threat from governments who want more power, and they are only protected by active, noisy, and unrelentless civil society. If we want a Human Rights Act, we must demand it. Together, only we can give human rights life.